For the past couple months, I've put both my Fold 4 and Duo 2 mostly to the side in favor of the 3-year-old LG V60. As a smartphone, it's a fairly standard handset that doesn't push the boundaries of smartphone design, but does harken back to a time when expandable storage and headphone jacks were more mainstream. As reviewers put it at launch, all good stuff, but not quite mind-blowing. A worthy upgrade from the previous year's V50, but nothing too impactful about the phone itself compared to that year's other Slab phones. Yet, one thing that makes it stand out, and more than a little interesting to me, is the LG dual screen, a clip-on USB-C monitor case that takes the V60 from ordinary to a bit of an anomaly. As far as multi-screen handheld PCs go, it's an interesting modular take. Unfortunately, there's one key issue that needs to be said up front. Even with the addition of a case containing a secondary display, the V60 is not a dual screen device. Or at least, it's not a device designed specifically around any conceptualization of dual screen usage. Rather, it's a single screen phone with an accessory that adds an external monitor that looks and operates like an entirely separate phone, notch and all. It's weird. It's a bit over the top. And it's part of what makes the V60 one of my favorite handheld devices to use since I picked up the Duo 2 almost 2 years ago. Let's take a look. Let's start by going over the Slab phone by itself. For anyone wondering, the V60 is perfectly usable here in the year 2024. You need very specific use cases to naturally feel the difference between the Snapdragon 865 powering it versus something like the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 powering my Fold 4, or even the 8 Gen 3 phones launching this year. It's more than serviceable and reliable for most folks' use cases. However, one key thing to note is that this phone no longer receives firmware or security updates. My unlocked T-Mobile model shows a final Android 13 update in May 2023. That's still recent enough to comfortably use it as a primary device, like I've been doing, but it's also plenty of reason to keep banking info and sketchy sites far from this phone, which I've also been doing. In general, for outdated phones, common sense is key, with any substantial security risks being minimal, as long as I'm sticking to apps and websites I trust. Past those caveats, the only other sign that this is an older phone are the thicker bezels around the edges. Otherwise, there's no day-to-day difference between this and my newer devices from a performance perspective. Which is great, because I freaking love the feel of the V60 in hand. Its flat rails and flat back, with only the most minimal of camera bumps, are accompanied by a flat screen that feels comfortable to stare at for videos, texts, and games alike. The 60Hz OLED display also feels notably large and vibrant during regular use. More than a few reviews lamented that it didn't have a 90 or 120Hz display like other flagship phones released around the same time, but honestly, even while hopping between it, my Fold 4, and my Duo 2, it's hard for me to notice a huge difference during regular use. Possibly the only gripe I have about the display is that it's just slightly too big to use comfortably with one hand without a ton of fiddling. Every time I pick it up, it makes me yearn for Samsung's floating app launcher, which enables me to easily hold my Fold 4 from the center. Still, that's only a minor gripe for me, to be honest. Plus, as someone who only uses wired headphones these days, I'm fine sacrificing a handy software feature for a device that still has a headphone jack. In general, the V60 is just about the perfect everyday carry for someone like me. And it sucks that there's no newer model with security updates for me to use as the business phone I need to carry in my pocket throughout the week. As good as it feels to use for general, everyday tasks, it also feels a lot better to use for gaming than other Slab phones I have on hand, or even its cousin, the LG Wing. Using that large, flat display to stream games from GeForce Now in widescreen never ceases to be a joy on something this size. Ukulele looks punchy in the same way that made me really appreciate the Wing's massive size, but with none of the awkward light fall off from a curved display. Unfortunately, also like the Wing, it's worth noting that I've had a bit of difficulty getting my GameSir X2 on and off. Being an older phone with a slightly larger size display than some current phones, those extra bezels make the V60 an especially long device. When outside the dual screen case, it's a phone that benefits from using a phone clip or tablet-sized telescopic controller. It's a bit of a hassle, but also worth it more often than not. Of course, this phone's not limited to streaming. The Snapdragon 865 is still a fantastic chipset for emulation that can push Dolphin and Aether SX2 to run games at or close to the screen's native resolution. The only time I've experienced hitches was when I purposefully pushed the phone beyond where I typically needed to go. Even PS Vita and Windows emulation feel decent on this phone, depending on the game, of course. In the same way I've recommended a Galaxy S20 as a basic emulation device in the past, I'd have no qualms pointing someone toward this gorgeous device if they're looking for an emulation handheld under $200 with better build quality than something from Retroid. All of which is, of course, only half the story for this phone. As a standard flagship from a known company, it's not too difficult to imagine it being a solid pocket computer, at least on par with something like that year's Galaxy phone. The real intrigue of the V60 comes from the LG dual-screen case. By slotting my V60 into the case, I make it twice as thick and moderately more useful due to having a second screen. I've pretty much defaulted to carrying the phone in the dual-screen case at this point, and can tell you that it's simultaneously the V60's greatest strength and largest miss. Starting from the top, as just a sturdy clamshell case, there's a lot to like about the LG dual screen. The back is rubberized, eliminating any slippage the phone's glass back might typically experience on a table. The front has a small display for date, time, battery, and notifications that's incredibly useful for quickly checking the phone's status. And the entire thing acts as a heavy-duty screen protector to prevent random scuffs and scratches as the phone sits in my pocket. It's all pretty great. My main gripe is that it commits the cardinal sin of converting the V60's USB-C port into a proprietary magnetic charging port. From what I've read, a matching cable would have come with the case at launch, but I, here in the future, bought the case secondhand without receiving a cable. Unless I'm willing to fork out an extra $30 for an adapter on eBay, I'm pretty much limited to wireless charging, which is fine, but also creates an extra annoyance for transferring files on and off the phone. As another minor gripe, I also wish the front glass weren't so damn reflective. There's utility for some folks, I'm sure, but I'd prefer a matte finish that'd be less likely to get scratched or collect fingerprints over time, or, blind someone while I have it tilted toward a light in public. This balance of great ideas and confusing omissions is really what defines usage of the V60 as a multi-display device. With the second screen enabled, I have the option to launch an app on the second screen, or swap the apps between the screens. That's it. Outside a few apps with dedicated tablet views, there's no native option to extend displays at will. Equally as unfortunate is that swapping displays is the only option to get an app from one screen to the other. There's no Duo-style drag to move, and the Axon M style button to send an app to another screen is hidden behind a floating window. These missing features make actual usage of the second screen more cumbersome in practice. Anytime I want to use both screens productively, there's always an extra thought or button push that slows me down. Everything feels a bit unnatural compared to other phones in my collection. That's without even getting into the lack of communication between the screens. On a Surface Duo, a link opened to an external app on one screen will open that app on the other screen, if that screen's not already occupied. I'm constantly using this feature to quickly read articles that show up on social media feeds, search Reddit via Google, or click through links in emails. The V60, meanwhile, can't seem to open anything on the second screen, even if the target app's already open. It's a multi-screen device that's eager to keep focus on one screen, and usage really hurts because of it. It was a lot easier to forgive these pain points on the wing, considering it was a highly experimental first-generation device. Yet, the LG dual screen for V60 is a third-generation accessory, and it feels like LG didn't put enough thought into how folks might actually use a second screen for everyday use cases. Part of this is technically fixable with Wide Mode for LG, a plugin developed by Yutaka Tsumori to allow users to manually span almost any app across both displays. It's neat, but a bit janky. Some apps like Outlook work like a charm, but others suffer from not splitting evenly across both screens. There's a lot of trial and most of it's error with something like this. Not because Wide Mode wasn't built well, but because LG didn't account for these experiences as well as they could have. Since it's not a native tool, Wide Mode can also only be activated via the Quick Settings shade, instead of the usual floating dual screen controls. Considering Wide Mode deactivates anytime the app refreshes its layout, that limitation can get annoying fast. Personally, I've gotten around it by mapping the Wide Mode toggle to the phone's assistant key using an app called Tasker. Other folks have created more sophisticated solutions over the years, but this manual toggle works great for triggering Wide Mode whenever I need it, which I definitely did once I started using the V60 for multi-screen gaming. Outside a few pre-packed experiences, the main use case of the second screen across most gaming apps is the built-in LG Gamepad. The feature sits in the game launcher and allows for one screen to be turned into a full-on virtual gamepad. The gamepad can be used for either system navigation or X-input style controls for games that support it. Support seems to typically be enforced based on whether a game is launched from the game launcher. So most apps, ranging from Game Pass to Aether SX2, will actually support it without too much fuss as long as they're added to the game launcher. Which is great, because they are possibly the best touch controls I've ever used. The amount of space afforded by using a full smartphone display as a controller feels very comfortable. Meanwhile, the haptics for button presses feels just right, especially on the thumbsticks. They both give off light vibrations at each step of input. In practice, it makes the tactile feel of using them leagues ahead of any other touch controls to the extent that they feel actually comfortable to use for shooters. Which is honestly wild. There's one small caveat though. Not all apps can use the gamepad. Emulators like Dolphin and Vita 3K aren't quite sure what to do with the input, or at least, they can't detect the gamepad as a controller. Luckily, on top of several different gamepad layouts, LG included a feature to map gamepad buttons to any touch point on the other screen. It comes with the downside of losing those fine joystick haptics, but allow for an incredible amount of compatibility between apps for anyone willing to put in the manual effort. I've personally loved messing around with the gamepad over the past couple months, and think it'd be perfect for anyone looking for a phone to comfortably game on without carrying around an extra controller. Even more folks will probably appreciate using the V60 for DS and, well, maybe 3DS emulation once the dust from Citra's demise clears. Slightly wider than a 3DS XL, the V60 offers ample space to scale up big, beautiful screens while still leaving plenty of room for touch controls. Quite possibly, this is the best touch control setup for either DS or 3DS that I've used to date. The sheer size of the V60 makes it incredibly comfortable to arrange buttons around the bottom screen's edges, while still being able to comfortably hit each button. If I could just add in a physical shoulder button, this would be the perfect way to play an abundance of games that don't require lots of input in quick succession. And make no mistake, the Snapdragon 865 can keep up every step of the way. With asynchronous shaders enabled, I was able to play every 3DS game I threw at it at 3x resolution via Citra MMJ, with very little stutter. In general, the biggest limitations seem to come from the emulator rather than the hardware. For example, Alpha Sapphire runs smoothly, but still has texture-related issues for certain Pokemon. That's kinda expected with Citra MMJ though. As long as I go in with those expectations, I still have a blast. Especially with the novelty of designing some of my own backgrounds and buttons to go along with Citra MMJ, I've been having a great time emulating dual screen consoles on the V60. Unfortunately, there are still some inherent issues that help the Surface Duo 2 retain its spot as the best Android device for dual screen emulation on the market. The first is the size. Due to the V60 having standard size displays with standard size aspect ratios, there's large black bars around its virtualized displays if I decided to use anything other than touch controls to control my games. The second issue is the size. The dual screen case makes the V60 just large enough to not fit in my GameStar X2, and the lack of USB-C ports will make it incompatible with most other controllers currently on the market. Short of GameStar making a larger Bluetooth version of the X2 to fit tablets, or sourcing a hyper-specific or modified Bluetooth controller that can work around this massive case, dual screen emulation is limited to touch controls on the V60. Meanwhile, the Duo 2 is just the right size to mimic a 3DS's displays almost exactly while accommodating most telescopic controllers on the market. If you're interested in the most pocketable, flexible dual screen emulation device on the market, Microsoft's handheld still takes the cake. With that in mind, unless you get lucky, the Duo 2 retails for over $500 these days in good condition. My V60 and case only costs about $200 from eBay. That's even cheaper than the current going rate for the Duo 1 here in the US, with better raw performance overall. For those who don't mind touch controls, I can see the V60 being a great entry-level dual screen emulation device. Let's wrap up this video with some final thoughts. I have had a lot more fun using the V60 these past few months than I thought I would. Ultimately, I'm leaving this experience with similar thoughts as those provided by Chris Velasco in his 2020 review of the V60, describing the device as, technically average, but a joy to use nonetheless. As the final flagship phone from LG prior to them shuttering their smartphone division, it's sure to leave a strong legacy to the folks who appreciated LG's design philosophy of packing as much smartphone as possible into their devices. Though, even as this interesting hybrid multi-screen device, it's not quite as useful as either of the Surface Duos that came after it for any task that could benefit from multiple screens. Like many phones LG put out over the years, the V60 feels like a balance between great ideas and obvious compromises. Whether those compromises would gnaw at me more if I used the V60 for a full year or more is, hard to say. But one thing's for sure. LG's multi-screen ambitions mark a time when smartphone innovation was about more than the size of a display's crease, and when phones were just starting to get fun. Those are my thoughts though. Now's the time when I ask for yours. Did you pick up an LG V60 when it was new and have thoughts of your own you'd like to share? Are you someone who's dying to have more than one screen on your smartphone for a specific use case? Let me know down in the comments. As always, if you found this video interesting or informative, go ahead and give it a like to let me know. Then be sure to get subscribed for more dual screen tech in the very near future. Also, if you're interested in custom Citra MMJ layouts I showed in this video, there will be a link to the Game Data Ko-fi shop in the description to download those for yourself. Although, be aware that given the current state of Citra, if MMJ gets taken down as well by the time you're watching this, I might remove that shop listing. Though, even then, I'd still recommend checking out the video description. That's where you can find links to our social media accounts, alongside some reviews of the LG V60 from launch if you're interested. The phone wasn't terribly impactful, all things considered. It kind of launched and then faded from most folks' consciousness just as quickly, but it's still interesting to look back and see where LG was at, and some of their final thoughts about expanding how folks might use a smartphone. Anyway, that's going to be all for this video. Thank you so much for staying all the way until the end. Until next time, catch you later.